Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, March 27th, 2024. I know a lot of people have been paying attention to this Missouri federal lawsuit regarding federal coercion of social media companies, but there's another lawsuit in the other direction launched just, I believe, last week, where the feds just sued Apple Inc. to basically coerce the company into giving up many of their long-standing business practices that have made the company what it is today. And all of course, this is done to supposedly protect you from what they call anti-competitive behavior, as if the government actually protects anything but its own power. There are 5 main points to this lawsuit that I'm going to go over, and a bunch of demands. And I think the precedent that this type of thing establishes, well, it's building on previous precedent that they think that they can get away with this kind of thing, is really, really bad because it's another direction towards federal control over basically business in the United States. But so first I want to kick this off with a few choice quotes from the founding generation to give us an idea of how things are supposed to be. Here from John Jay, who ended up being the first Chief Justice of the United States, and he said, "With respect to the protection of national industry, I take it for granted that it will always flourish where it is lucrative and not discouraged, which was the case in North America when I left. Every man then being at liberty by the law to cultivate the earth as he pleased, to raise what he pleased, to manufacture as he pleased, and to sell the produce of his labor to whom he pleased, and for the best prices, without any duties or impositions whatsoever." So that's how this first Chief Justice looked at, well, the best for industry in the United States. Basically, to manufacture as you choose how to do it. And then if you aren't controlled by government and no one is forced to buy or sell anything, then it's up to people if they choose they want to purchase. This is a very free market mentality. So was Pelatiah Webster in his essay on free trade and finance, someone I don't quote very often, but a good one. "I propose to take off every restraint and limitation from our commerce. Let trade be as free as air." Or how about Thomas Jefferson? Now, these types of views were very, very common, even though they weren't universal. But Thomas Jefferson's view here in his first inaugural address, he's basically establishing the policies of the federal government in March of 1801. So you can see, you'll be able to see how different things are today from Jefferson's policy. He said, "A wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned." Don't tax the people. Don't tax them. This is the sum of good government. That's how Jefferson defines good government. And we are nowhere close to that today. But let's get to this, well, as Elizabeth Nolan Brown over at Reason puts it, the absurd Apple antitrust lawsuit. She writes that the U.S. Department of Justice, the DOJ, and 16 states are suing Apple over its alleged monopoly of the smartphone market. I can tell you, I have 2 smartphones. I have one that's an Apple product for personal use and one for the 10th Amendment Center, a business use, which is an Android product. If it was a monopoly, I mean, they, of course, define monopoly in a very weird way, but a monopoly means a monopoly. I couldn't own those 2 phones, first of all. I should just point out that absurd point of it. Anyways, that's not how government views these things. She says it's an absolutely bonkers lawsuit based on weird ideas about business and even weirder ideas about government. And unfortunately, weird in this this kind of context does not mean unusual or strange. Unfortunately, it's very common. She said the Apple lawsuit shows just how eager the Biden administration is to bring business decisions under federal control. And I wouldn't blame just the current administration. I think it's just building upon where things were left to it. And of course, the current one's always going to be worse than the previous one overall. If you zoom out and you get a big picture of it, they just keep building on it. Now here, I have a link. I will link to this in the show notes. Alan Mosley will organize these and put all the links to everything that I'm mentioning, the original source documents, the actual link to the DOJ civil complaint, which I have up here on the screen. I think it's like 88 pages. I've skimmed through quite a bit of it. I haven't read the whole thing in detail. I mean, it's boring, but you can get some really interesting highlights, and I've read some other stuff on this as well. But that'll all be linked to in the show notes, and I'll get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path2liberty a couple of hours after this live stream is done. So there are 5 main points to this federal lawsuit trying to basically coerce and control Apple Incorporated. And they start out here from Ed Hardy over at Cult of Mac. The DOJ cited the lack of an Android app to synchronize with Apple Watch as an example of Cupertino's anti-competitive behavior. So they're saying if you make a product and you don't make it available to work perfectly with your competition's product, you're not allowed to do that. That's what they're really trying to say. They're trying to say that because Apple's smartphone, well, you can sync a competitor. You could sync a Samsung smartphone with an Apple iPhone or an Apple Watch, etc. But you're going to have different functionality if you use the company's own products versus another one. I mean, what are they going to start saying? You can't use aftermarket auto parts unless they can work on everything? I don't know. Maybe my analogy isn't great there. But it certainly seems absurd to me, and hopefully it does to you as well. They write, this is Ed over at Cult of Mac, Apple's refusal to allow other payment systems access to iPhone's tap-to-pay system also come under fire. Quote, this is from the complaint, inhibiting the creation of cross-platform third-party digital wallets, according to the Justice Department. So they're saying if you want to have payment on your phone, a tap-to-pay payment, you got to have everybody's on there. Or you just have to have your competitors. Or maybe they are getting pressure from a high-financed, well-financed, well-funded competitor that says, well, maybe you should sue them because we want to get in here. Maybe, a whole group of organizations or businesses out there are pressuring the government to take on Apple to reduce their ability to lock down their products as they choose and whether or not customers want to buy that or not, and force them to open it up to competition. I'm not sure. In addition, Ed writes, regulators object to an Apple policy that blocked cloud gaming services from the App Store. But that might explain why Apple reversed that rule in January. I'm pretty confident that this has been kind of in the works for quite some time. It is a very, very long process here. Now, going forward, the last 2 are really interesting. iMessage, their kind of text, I guess we'll call it their texting platform, also came up with the DOJ alleging, quote, Apple has made the quality of cross-platform messaging worse, less innovative, and less secure for users so that its customers have to keep buying iPhones. Now, as an aside, I don't really know the tech history like a lot of these other people like Ed and some other people I'm going to cite here today, but I know for a fact that at one time when you had a phone plan, you got charged for a certain amount of texts. We all have these unlimited plans today, or supposedly unlimited plans, but you would get a certain amount of texts, and then after that, you'd have to start paying additional, or maybe you just wouldn't be able to send any more texts for that particular month. And then iMessage came out because they got around that process. That's what I believe the creation of iMessage came in from. And then it doesn't work the same as the SMS system that comes from other platforms like Android, or I think Windows Phone may have used that back in the day. And that platform or that version doesn't really work super well. Now, they are saying that they're going to open this up, but I don't want to get into the debates about whether these are good or bad. I want to look at the big overall picture more so of federal coercion of another American company. And then it also accused the iPhone maker of stifling what it calls super apps. The Department of Justice said, quote, Apple has disrupted the growth of apps with broad functionality that would make it easier for consumers to switch between competing smartphone platforms. But, as Ed notes, it gave no example of these, though. Now, you might not be familiar with the super app. We're not always deep into technology here. I know I find it interesting on my own time. But this is a really interesting thing for them to actually take Apple on. These are really popular in Asia, Southeast Asia, China, for example. And here from Wikipedia, they describe a super app as a mobile or web application that can provide multiple services, including payment and instant messaging services, effectively becoming an all-encompassing, self-contained commerce and communication online platform that embraces many aspects of personal and commercial life. Notable examples include Alipay, WeChat in China, Grab in Southeast Asia, one I'd never heard of, Tata Neu in India. These are apps that basically kind of put it all together. You get messaging, video calls, social networking, e-commerce. I think even on WeChat, you can have food delivery, it replaces like car services, banking, everything all in one. Now, John Prosser, who's my probably my favorite technology podcast and YouTube guy, he put it this way over at Front Page Tech. Question: is it fine for a single app to monopolize a user's data and experience, but the company that makes the phone can't? So they're really arguing, if you think about it, the DOJ is basically suing Apple for being monopolistic, at least in their definition of the term monopolistic, because it really isn't a monopoly in the real definition of the term, because it supposedly stifles the potential for a monopolistic app on their phone. It's totally absurd. Now, we do know that Elon Musk over at Twitter X is trying to turn that platform into a super app with voice calling, video calling. He wants to add banking services. I know he's getting financial services licenses in various states. So if he actually is able to turn that into a super app for the West, I don't think for a second that if he actually pulls it off, that the feds won't be filing some kind of anti-competition lawsuit against him as well. So they're just basically just trying to control everybody, get their dirty little mitts into everything, and maybe just trying to get some billions of dollars in fines, because as they're destroying the economy with all their printing, they probably need another collection service. Anyways, more from the lawsuit here. Let me see if I can get this pulled up on the screen. This is from page 68 of the complaint. They say, for example, if an iPhone user, this is how Apple's iPhone platform is anti-competitive and monopolistic. If an iPhone user wants to buy an Android smartphone, they are likely to face significant financial, technological, and behavioral obstacles to switching. The user may need to relearn how to operate their smartphone using a new interface. I'm sorry, I'm chuckling at this, because anytime you switch from one product to another, you may have a different format in how you operate it. People who switch from an internal combustible engine car to an electric Tesla, they're going to have a different experience in how that product works. If you switch from a Windows machine, which I did some years ago, to a MacBook for your computer, it's totally foreign. It took me months to change the kind of the brain hand memory that I had of where things were and how to do stuff and how to operate the system when you change to a new format. If you change from playing football to soccer, you're going to have to learn new stuff. When you make a choice to go a different direction, you have to learn something. Now, that's a reason for the federal government to demand an undisclosed, yet to be told financial sum of penalties. This is, as Elizabeth put it over at Reason, this is pretty bonkers. The user may need to relearn how to operate their smartphone using a new interface, transfer large amounts of data like contacts, purchase new apps, or transfer or buy new subscriptions and accessories. Now, of course, they're not suing the other side. I mean, we're looking at this in kind of a party first mentality. There's two teams. You've got Android and iPhone. If let's say you want to switch like I did from Android, at least for my personal use, from an Android phone to an iPhone, I had to learn all new things. I had to buy some new apps. I had to buy new hardware. I got new earbuds. This was expensive, but I made a choice because I wanted it to sync better with my laptop, which seemed to be working well for my video production and my live streaming and all that. And I made a business choice and a personal choice, but I had to budget for that. Now, should the federal government come in and make the Google platform make it easy or cheap or free for me to switch to something else? I think they really want to stifle competition, because if you have a real communist mentality, you don't like the idea of people having choice in the market. You just want the government to tell everyone what their choices are, and that's it. And that's really, I think, the pervasive mentality that we're facing here with this. Anyways, here from page 9 of the complaint, by allowing third-party smartwatches to connect to an iPhone, but not allowing the full feature set, they say Apple has denied users access to, and this is funny, high-performing smartwatches with preferred styling better user interfaces and services or better batteries. Now, let's say someone thinks a phone or a watch is a better style. Okay, I mean, is it the government's job to make sure that your preferred fashion sense matches with your preferred smartphone or not? The notion that some people or enough people think that this is an acceptable use of government power despite any limitations in the Constitution, which I'm not really going to get to on this yet today, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is just absurd. If this is a smart use of government power, we've got a lot of problems with the people themselves because this is absolutely nonsense. And one more from the complaint here. They say Apple's smartwatch, Apple Watch, is only compatible with the iPhone. So if Apple can steer a user towards buying an Apple Watch, it becomes more costly for that person to switch because they have to get an iPhone. And I was thinking about getting one of these smartwatches for my mom as she's aging to kind of have some of the health monitoring and things like that. And I was thinking, maybe an Apple smartwatch, but it doesn't really work with her Android phone. So it doesn't do all the things that I want it to do. So I'm going to have to look at other options. But again, is it that I want the government to force Apple to make it work with these other platforms? I think that's absurd. That's bad. That's really dangerous because the power that you give government to do something, to force first of all, if you're okay with using force, because ultimately what this gets down to is they have to use the threat of violence to make this happen. There is no freedom in this. Like, yeah, maybe I would like Apple to be able to make their product more compatible, or I would like Google to make their product more compatible with certain things. But as soon as you get down to saying, well, if you don't do it, I want dudes with guns to be able to show up your door and to shut you down or to fine you and control you, then I am a terrible human being. I mean, that's ultimately what it gets down to. I want to vote with my dollars and purchase the products that I'm going to purchase that are best for me and then not purchase the ones that are not best for me. That's really ultimately what it gets down to. Now, most people, as I was mentioning, when they're discussing this, they're really debating whether the DOJ's claims are correct or not. And I kind of fell into that a little bit as well when I was talking about iMessage, talking about the values of it and the benefits, like, oh, this is a good thing, and here's the reason why they did this. And I don't think that even really needs to be said because that can be covered all over the place. And whether Apple is right or wrong in their business decisions is ultimately going to fall on them. And I think most people are ignoring what I think you're probably understanding that I'm getting to here, which is the underlying fundamental issue here. And that for that, we have to back it up a bit. Here from the Guardian co.uk almost 2 years ago, Apple to put USB-C connectors in iPhones to comply with EU rules. On my old iPhone 13 mini here, I have what's called for those of you who don't have one of these, when you plug it into charge or you want to add accessories, I have a lightning connector. This is a very old school. They've had different versions of this. It's a proprietary Apple thing. It's kind of a pain in the butt because it's not universal. I've got like an iPad in front of me that runs on USB-C, so I need a different cord for this, and I got to buy more stuff, and it's probably a good business practice to make something proprietary because then you have to buy the accessory specific for it. And a lot of people have wanted a USB-C. It's more universal. You can do more stuff with it, and they want that on the iPhone, and they've been asking Apple to do this, and Apple doesn't do it. But then the EU, of course, nanny state EU comes in and forces them to put USB-C connectors, change the whole platform. And the firm, it says, has no choice but to switch from their proprietary Lightning port to the USB standard in the EU. And Apple's head of marketing, Greg Joswiak, here from the report, says the company is conceding defeat. Quote, obviously, we'll have to comply. We have no choice. So we know for a fact that they didn't want to do this for whatever reason. Now, it isn't up to us. We aren't running a smartphone business. We can have opinions on this, but ultimately, the people who run their business, as John Jay was saying at the beginning, as Thomas Jefferson, they have to have the freedom to manufacture things as they please, because ultimately that's how you learn what works and what doesn't work. And then the market responds in certain ways. Now, here back to John Prosser at Front Page Tech. I've never cited him on the show. This is my favorite guy to listen to and watch when I'm hanging out doing some work and I'm not wanting to listen to political nonsense all day, because sometimes it does get a little overwhelming. I find it really interesting, but he's got a really, really great take on this and talking about when the EU did this. And you're going to wonder, why are we talking about the EU? But he says when the EU mandated that Apple put USB Type-C on the iPhone, and Apple listened, I immediately voiced my concerns, saying that yes, while USB-C on iPhone is objectively a good thing, it's an improvement in the technology. And when I upgrade, I'll probably go to that one as well. And I can see how I can add different external devices. I can probably run a second live stream much better than I tried to earlier this year in vertical format on TikTok or YouTube Shorts or something. I can expand my work here because of that device. So John is saying, yeah, I like having the USB-C there. But he says it was also a very clever Trojan horse. That's a really good way to describe it. He was trying to say, he said, I was trying to say that the fact that Apple caved, even just that once, it creates a very slippery slope. And then he wraps the story up with, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to that slippery slope. Because once one government does it and sees that Apple is willing to just say, okay, we want the easy way out, we'll go with what you tell us, you're going to find other nanny state the Elizabeth Warrens of the world coming in and telling you, well, now we want to control you in this way. The whole video is actually really, really interesting. It's really great. It'll be linked to in the show notes. It's a YouTube, so I'm not sure if you love the platform or hate it, but it'll be there linked to in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. One of my favorite parts of the video is where he cites the, I guess now classic children's book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. This is a lesson on a slippery slope. Basically, the story goes, if you give a mouse a cookie, they come to your door, they give you a mouse a cookie, then they're going to ask for some milk. And then you give them some milk, and then they're going to ask for another thing, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. This is what the founders would have called the detestable precedent. John Dickinson, in his response to the Stamp Act in 1765, he told the people, don't comply with this thing, even if you think it's just a tiny inconvenience, even if the tax is really small. Don't, because once you establish the detestable precedent, they will absolutely build upon that and expand it into more and more and more. So he came back to that same viewpoint in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, letter number 9 in 1767, which was a response to what became the hated Townsend Acts. At first, many people were saying, oh, well, we won against the Stamp Act, and this Townsend Act isn't really a huge deal, so, it's small, let's not worry about it. But Dickinson, throughout these letters, these were the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. So this was really, if you want to understand the viewpoints of the people, this was the top thing throughout the primary part of the revolution, 1767 through 1776. The revolution being the radical change in the viewpoints of the people that led to the war for independence. And he gave another example of a small precedent, even in an emergency situation, totally destroying freedom. He says here at the end of his 9th letter, Spain was once free. Their Cortes, which was their parliament, he says that their Cortes resembled our parliament. Sometimes I got to just let the penman of the revolution, his words, do the talking rather than my take. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent. One of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only to raise money without assembling the Cortes. TLDR, short version. In Spain, at some point, he's telling the history of how money could only be raised for any situation as long as the parliament was assembled. The parliaments were not assembled year-round. So because there was a war going on, he's saying, oh, you guys aren't assembled. This is an emergency. I can't wait for you guys to get back here. Maybe they had a process for getting back there relatively quickly, whatever the reason is. He's saying, I need in this emergency only the ability to raise money on the people without your support. Dickinson continued, the request was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, as we see so often today, it was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And the single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the Crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. From that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful. The people ceased to be free. He said a single concession to government power going beyond its limits was a precedent for more concessions in the future. Because once you move that line, they're always going to say there's another reason to move that line, another reason. So it started out with they could only raise money with the approval of the parliament, the representatives of the people. Then it became, well, I don't need the parliament in an emergency situation like a war. And then eventually it became, over time, I can raise money whenever I think it's necessary without the parliament. So then the parliament, it didn't matter if they existed or not, and the people ceased to be free. It was this single concession, this slippery slope that John Dickinson calls the detestable precedent. Now here back to Cult of Mac and Ed. I think it's Ed Hardy. This is what the DOJ wants. The Justice Department's lawsuit is seeking an unspecified financial penalty. I mean, if you've been following crypto lawsuits, it might be in the billions of dollars. They want lots of loot from these companies. It also wants the court to order Apple to open up messages, which they say Apple undermines with blue bubbles on Android. If you've ever texted in a group chat and you've got different colored bubbles going back and forth, you know who's on which platform. And because it's very popular with young people, they even talk about how a vast majority of teens in the United States, I think it's like almost 90% use this. It creates a societal pressure to use this product. So just because something's popular, they're saying, well, you can't do this. You have to make it work or look exactly the same. This is insane what they're doing. Bonkers is really a good way to describe it. It wants the court to order Apple to open up messages, which Apple undermines with blue bubbles on Android, allow cloud streaming gaming apps, and alternative digital wallets with direct NFC access and more, including, I wonder, as a quick aside, I believe in recent years, Apple has been basically battling a little bit. Now, you may love Apple, you may hate Apple, you may think they're good guys or bad guys, too woke, not woke enough. It doesn't matter. At some point in there, they were actually battling a bit with the FBI over trying to remove encryption. The federal government, the surveillance apparatus, which is the entire federal government, doesn't like the fact that Apple uses end-to-end encryption in their messaging service, and I think in their calls as well. So they can't actually, even if they have your phone, even if they go up to Apple, unless someone unlocks it or they can somehow break into it, and they aren't always able to do this very easily or at all in some situations, they can't get access to the messages because they're encrypted, and it's end-to-end encrypted, which means that even Apple doesn't hold the keys. They wanted to require Apple to hold some kind of back door, and I think Apple was pushing back on this. And I wonder, and I'm just throwing it out there, this is my tinfoil hat side, I wonder if this is what really was the beginning of this lawsuit. If they're not going to give us access to everyone's communication, maybe we'll find another way to go after them and break down their company, their willingness to take a stand. So they also want to allow cross-platform super apps that perform a host of functions, presumably something like China's WeChat or Elon Musk's plans for X. They want to allow cloud streaming gaming apps, allow better messaging between iOS and competing platforms, especially Android, expand Apple Watch connectivity to alternative platforms to enable easier platform switching, and to allow third-party digital wallets with tap to pay. Now, all of these things might be great ideas. They might be awesome. Like, as a customer, you might be thinking, this is great. I would love to go to that product if I could get all these things, and maybe I'll buy it. But then maybe there's people who are like, I don't want all this stuff. And again, ultimately, this gets down to a business making a decision of how it's going to operate, a business being very successful in that decision. And then once it gets to a point of success of doing something that it's been doing for 20 years now, suddenly now it's too successful. It's got 60% of the market, I believe, in the United States. So therefore, 60% of the market is now considered anti-competitive, and you have to break that down. You don't want them. You have to use government force to tell people that their choice was wrong in purchasing these things. And that's basically what Elizabeth Nolan Brown, the way she describes it over at Reason. As far as consumer complaints go, of course, there's nothing wrong with some of the DOJ's concerns. If you're just thinking about it from a customer standpoint, like I would like this product to do this, that's fine. We might wish that every product we owned was compatible with every other product we owned. I actually don't, because I understand as soon as you have an open thing like that, you create kind of loopholes for security. And one of the reasons you want a lockdown products in some situations, I guess, would be that you can kind of keep out bad actors a little bit better. And maybe the end-to-end encryption thing is a big part of this underlying it. I'm just throwing that out there. We might wish, she writes, that every product we own was compatible with every other and that they worked in perfect tandem. We might wish we never had to consider trade-offs between price, function, design, compatibility, etc. Where this gets crazy is the federal government saying consumers being able to choose whether to use a product is not good enough. And you can see how far that departs from the views of Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address in 1801, John Jay's views in 1780, Pelatiah Webster's views in 1779. So the founding generation had a much different view of how government should be engaging in this situation. In other words, really not at all. Consumers being able to choose whether to use a product is not good enough. That's basically what the federal government is telling us. We're going to step in and say that this business has to make a competitor's products more accessible. We're going to break you down. It has a legal duty to undermine its own business interests to help outside, and many would argue, inferior products compete. Is it their duty to help other companies compete? And I know, especially in the technology world, a lot of people can tend to be what John Prosser used to call his podcast co-host, lefty bobefties. They really come from the socialist end of the spectrum, and they love this type of government thing. So it is interesting to see some of the technology kind of Apple geeks out there saying, you hear them talk about how government regulation is always so awesome. But then in this situation, maybe a little slow down. We shouldn't, it's too established. But let's say you love the idea of government going after Apple. Let's say you hate Apple for whatever reason. That's cool. Let's say you think these are good end results. Whatever your goal is, you have to think if government is going to use a power for something you like, eventually the worst person on earth, your ultimate enemy, is going to have that same power. And they probably will not use it in ways that you want them to use it. In fact, it'll probably be opposite. And that's how John Jay described things in 1788. He said, remember that a power to do good always involves a power to do harm. He was the first Chief Justice. Here's the third Chief Justice, Oliver Ellsworth, back in 1787. He wasn't the Chief Justice at that point, but this was in the ratification debates. He said, a power of doing good always implies a power to do evil if the person or party be disposed. Well, I hope you found this one interesting. It's a little different type of episode than I normally do. If you want to hear more episodes like this in the future, please let me know in the chat or email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. If you want to help us get this show out to more and more people, absolutely nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. We have never been sponsored. You should not be getting ads. Depending on the platform. We don't actually have ads on YouTube, for example, or on the podcasts. We don't have sponsors in the middle. The sponsors really are you, our members. You can support us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider joining us today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment to say a huge thank you to a handful of people who have joined us lately. There's Amanda in North Carolina, Martin in Pennsylvania, Cheryl in Texas, David in Utah, Michael in North New York, and Denise in North Carolina. North Carolina representing. I really appreciate you guys. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.